Hello and welcome back to Catholic Reboot. This episode is titled The Different Rites of the Catholic Church. And we're really honored to have Chorbishop Anthony Spinosa, who is currently in charge of the Shrine of Our Lady of Lebanon in North Jackson, Ohio, which is right near Youngstown, Ohio. At the end of this entire episode, I'm actually going to put placards up that give all the locations and also a little bit more on Our Lady of Lebanon Shrine and their wonderful annual feast of the Assumption on August 15th. Just so you know, when we refer to the title Chorbishop, that comes more from the Eastern Rite, and Chorbishop Spinosa will explain that much better, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview. That term Chorbishop is actually a derivative of Greek, which translates to rural bishop. It's first mentioned in the Western Church is probably around the 5th or 6th century, where they were mostly found in Germany, Bavaria area more specifically, and the Frankish countries. In the Western Church, they were treated much as auxiliary bishops were and operated like archdeacons or vicar generals. Now in the Maronite Rite, which is the rite that Bishop Spinosa is in, the Chorbishop is the highest of the three median orders, so ranking above the orders of archdeacon. Like a bishop, a Chorbishop is ordained and entitled to all the vestments proper to a bishop, including the mitre, the hat, and the crozier, the staff. And that's all I'm going to explain at this point, but just so you know the level at which Chorbishop Spinosa is at. And I thought this was a very good interview. He explained very well, and then I just kind of asked additional questions around the differences of the rites. So from here, we'll move right into the interview. Thank you.
You're going to ask me a question first?
Yes. Your Excellency, this is Chorbishop Anthony Spinosa, who is from the Maronite Rite, and I had asked him to give an overview of the different rites in the Catholic Church. So I will stop talking and actually just hand it over to him from here.
I'm ready to go.
Okay.
Excuse me. Before we even begin to try to understand the different rites of the church, we have to understand the origin. The church began in Jerusalem. And although there really is no rite of Jerusalem, because it's the origin of all of the rites, the church very quickly began to spread to different parts of, at that time, the known world. Peter and the apostles made their way up to Antioch and eventually over into Constantinople, eventually over into Rome. Some of the apostles went kind of south into Alexandria, which is northern Egypt. And while others, especially St. Thomas, went east into what we would know now as kind of the Middle East, especially Iraq, Baghdad, places like that, India. So the church began to develop from these different cities. And the Maronites, like all the others, were influenced by the characteristics of those cities. And the Maronites had their origin in the city of Antioch, and it had a very certain way, a specific way of worshiping according to the culture and the language of the region. At that time, Syriac or Aramaic was very much a part of the culture, as it was in Jerusalem. Most people think that Jesus spoke Hebrew. Well, he probably knew Hebrew, obviously, but also the daily vernacular was a form of Aramaic. or sometimes, as we call it, Syriac. And he would have used that rather frequently. The Maronites, as they kind of developed in the area of Antioch, were still under that Semitic influence. And as part of their vernacular, and then eventually the liturgical language was Aramaic. And there are different dialects of Aramaic. The Maronites used what is known as a West Syriac dialect. And as things began to develop and the apostles went to different places, as they arrived in Constantinople, well, the language there was Greek. So they began to incorporate Greek into their prayer, into their liturgical practices. As the church expanded in Rome, obviously it was Latin, and the Latin tradition began to emerge. And those who were traveled into northern Africa, into Alexandria, you have the Coptic influence there with their own language and their traditions. And St. Thomas, as he went east into what we now know as India, Iraq, Iran, they also used a form of Aramaic, but it was an East Aramaic, a little slightly different alphabet and a slightly different dialect. So this is how the churches developed. Now, we obviously know that the Roman Rite, the Latin Rite, is the largest, but there are many Eastern churches coming from the other traditions of Antioch, of Alexandria, and also of Constantinople. Many times when people say, well, we're Eastern Catholic, we're Eastern Rite, they automatically think of the Byzantines because they have many different branches of Byzantine. Again, all according to culture. There are some Byzantines who speak Arabic. They're known as the Melkites. And then you have the Slavic Byzantines, who are Ukrainian, who are Russian, and excuse me, would also be from the area of Hungary, what used to be Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, Slovenia, all of those different places. So they still use the Greek liturgy, but they use it according to their own customs, most especially their language. And their language was very much a part of the liturgy. So they were using vernacular long before the Latin Church was using vernacular. And so it gets to be very interesting. The Maronites, as I said, used the Aramaic for century and century and century, and then began to use Arabic because then that became part of their liturgical, part of their daily language. It became part of the liturgical language as well. But officially, the Maronites still have Syriac, Aramaic, as the official liturgical language. So I may have confused you tremendously at this point. If you have any questions, please jump in.
Okay. You know, one of the questions I do have is, why is it that most Roman Catholics, or maybe the other Catholics in the different rites, don't know this? Why were we not raised to know about the Maronite?
Well, you know, again, it's part of the geographics of where you live, the demographics. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, just outside the city. And although there were many Eastern Rite Catholics around, the area that I lived in was basically Irish, Italian, Portuguese, Lithuanian. So you didn't have the exposure to the Eastern churches. There are places where the Eastern churches were more predominant, most especially in the Pennsylvania area, where you had Orthodox and Catholic Eastern churches. So I always joke that when you go through the hills of Pennsylvania, you'll see nothing but steeples and onion domes because you had so many of them there. It just depends where you live, where you grow up. Some places were very heavily Latin Rite Catholic, where others were not. So sometimes the Eastern churches suffered from people not understanding who they were, and they would automatically say, oh, well, they're Orthodox, they're not Catholic. And it was only because of lack of education or ignorance.
But when you do a tremendous thing every year on the Feast of the Assumption, where your shrine basically for 3 days is a huge celebration, and then you break out each of the, I think it's 3 days, where you'll have a Roman Catholic bishop or priest celebrate Mass, then you'll have the Maronite, and then you'll have, and I forget the third, is it
The Byzantines.
The Byzantines.
Byzantines, yeah.
Yeah. You yourself are able to say each of those Masses, or are you principally more the Maronite than the Roman?
No. Well, primarily, I'm a Maronite priest, so that's what I celebrate 99% of the time. Since I was raised Roman Rite and I was raised in the traditional Latin Mass, it wasn't until I was in my early teens when things really began to change. So I was accustomed to it. So I've always celebrated the Latin liturgy. And once I was ordained, I started to celebrate the Tridentine Mass as well, which I still do on occasion, not as often as I would like. I do not celebrate the Byzantine liturgy. I've concelebrated with the Byzantines. I'm not that familiar with it. But as far as the Feast of the Assumption goes, it's been a long-standing tradition here for many, many years at the shrine that we would have a 3-day celebration, a Triduum, to honor the Assumption of the Virgin. And we always begin with the Latin Rite liturgy. And most of the time, it is the local Latin bishop or another Latin bishop who is invited to come to celebrate that liturgy, the opening of the liturgy. And it is usually a Novus Ordo liturgy, obviously. On the second day, we usually have a Byzantine bishop. And we have many to choose from around here. We're very fortunate because we have the Romanians and the Ukrainians and the Ruthenians and the Melkites as well. So one of them will come and celebrate on the eve, the vigil of the Assumption. And what we've done in recent years, which people really love very, very much, we have the Byzantine burial service of the Virgin. And this impresses people because people do not realize that Our Lady died. She fell asleep. And this is why the eve of the Assumption is always called the Dormition, the falling asleep of the Virgin. And the Byzantines have this magnificent, beautiful service of chants and psalms. And they carry the shroud of the Virgin with her image on it. And it is actually like the Good Friday burial service of the Lord. But we call it the falling asleep. We take the shroud with her image on it into the Tower Chapel, and we close the doors, similar to the closing of the doors of our Lord's tomb. And then on the third day, we celebrate the Maronite liturgies, and we have several during the day. And our true Maronite bishops here from the United States attend, and occasionally we have others who come as well. And the feast day is really the largest celebration. In Lebanon, it is actually a national holiday.
Wow, I didn't know.
Yeah, it's one of those things that everyone celebrates, and sometimes even those who are not Christian will celebrate it as well.
Wow, okay.
So that Triduum tends to be very, very important. But that whole idea of the bringing in the Byzantines, the Latins, and the Maronites expresses the universality of the church. And that's why we do it.
Now, not to do too deep of a dive, but when you compare the liturgies of the Byzantine, the Maronite, and the Roman Catholic, I was able to see the Maronite liturgy, and I do see some differences, especially during the consecration, right? But are there specifics that you can point to where this is where the liturgies are somewhat different?
Well, the basic structure of the liturgy will remain the same. What we would call the anaphora or the canon is pretty much the same in all the rites. The prayers are different, but it follows that same structure of the offering of the gifts, the consecration of the gifts, the anamnesis, the remembrance of the gifts,
Right.
the calling down of the Holy Spirit on the gifts. All of those remain the same, regardless of whatever the rite is. With the biggest exception would be what we would call today the liturgy of the word,
Right.
or the Mass of the catechumens, according to the traditional terminology. Those prayers are different in all of the rites. They vary quite a bit from the Byzantines, the Maronites, and the Latins. So I would say that's probably the biggest of the differences there. But the anaphora, the canon, they all follow pretty much the same structure.
Now, as far as the music, I'm sorry.
You have to accomplish a certain thing during the anaphora, and it requires all of those elements to do it.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to put those up. Later on, I want to get those from you, so I can just put a little chart up. When you're referring to the liturgical music, do you see a difference in the Byzantine, the Maronite, and the Roman Catholic today?
Oh, yes, and it depends on where you want to go in history.
Okay.
Now, if you want to go to post-1960 Catholic music, I will not discuss that with you.
Right.
You can make your own determination. Music always comes from, again, the culture. Now, the uniqueness with the Roman liturgy is that you have the plain chant, the Gregorian chant, which is absolutely unique unto itself. But even with the Roman liturgy, there have been many developments of different types of music. And that's why you have the polyphonic masses.
Right.
And the liturgy that was composed in honor of Pope Marcellus was to demonstrate how you could use polyphony in the church. I believe it was Palestrina who did that, to prove to him it didn't have to be strictly chant.
Okay.
You could use polyphony. And ever since then, the church exploded with liturgical music.
Right.
And then you had, the Baroque, the Renaissance. Some of it was very good, some of it wasn't so good. Now, in the Eastern churches, the chants and the music really come from what people were used to singing themselves, especially with the Maronites. The Syriac music is very simple. They are not complicated melodies, but they really come from what we would refer to as folk music.
Oh, wow, really?
There would be melodies that people were familiar with. And that's not to say that melodies were not composed over the years. They were. But the origins really were from very simple melodies. Unlike, say, the Latin Church, where you have such a huge treasury of liturgical music, in the Syriac Church, you really don't have that. You have some very basic melodies that are used over and over again for different parts of the liturgy, and it's adapted according to the words that are needed, the prayers that are needed. And so you didn't have that huge, explosion of liturgical music developing. Pardon me. The Byzantines have a lot of music. And again, it's according to their tradition. The way the Byzantine Melkite Church chants is different from the Slavic churches, like the Ukrainians or the Russians. Their music is very different. or the Romanians, and even sometimes the Ruthenians. The Greeks use their own melodies that are identified specifically with Greek-speaking people. So it's all considered Byzantine music, but Byzantine according to ethnicity.
Right.
So the melodies do vary. Some I like better than others. I mean, I'm a fan of the Slavic Byzantine music. I think it's spectacular.
Okay.
It's wonderful. So it's interesting. Sometimes people just do not realize how much the church adapts or develops according to the needs of the people.
Yeah.
The traditions of the church don't drop from the sky.
Right.
Our Lord doesn't say, by the way, this is what you're going to use, and it comes down to us. It really comes from grassroots, and the church uses that to develop traditions and their customs,
Yeah.
which makes it very important.
Now, when our parents were celebrating, right? Let's say the old days. Let's say the excuse me, the 40s and 50s. It was mostly what is it? Polyphonic? I can't say the word. Polyphony
Yeah.
versus Gregorian chant, right? I mean that the idea they were a little surprised when they did the transition from Gregorian to that, right?
Yes, and again, it depends where you lived.
Oh, okay.
If you lived in a big city, in a large parish that had good resources, chances are you would hear a lot of Gregorian chant.
Okay.
And it was primarily the men who would do it at that time.
Okay.
And you would also hear polyphonic masses, the polyphony. But what you had come up in the late 19th and early 20th century was kind of an American phenomenon. You had music being composed that was similar but not truly authentic. There were the simple versions of Gregorian chant that most parishes used because, I'll be honest with you, Gregorian chant, it's hard work.
Yeah, it is.
Just last night for the Feast of the Annunciation, we had a Tridentine Mass here at the shrine. My choir and scholar did an excellent job, but it takes a lot of work to get that chant down. Most parishes didn't do it. So you had composers who would write these simplified chants that used what they called psalm tones. They're the 8 psalm tones that they use for the chanting of the divine office in the monasteries. And they adapted those melodies, those simple 8 melodies, to use for the propers when you didn't have a choir that could actually do the full-blown, authentic Gregorian chant. So what you had in Latin Rite parishes many times was simplified versions of this. And then you had rise to many ethnic hymns because you had many immigrants and they all sang in their own language. And I admire the Polish people. They have more liturgical hymns than God even knows. When you go to a Polish mass, they sing and they sing and they sing. A Polish friend of mine said, one closing hymn is not enough. You need at least 2.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so they have all of these wonderful melodies, again, which tended to be local folk melodies, which have become absolutely wonderful liturgical hymns. And that's what you had in the 20th century, early 20th century, the adaptation of a lot of music for liturgical use because they didn't have the resources and the talent to do it. That you found in monasteries, larger churches, cathedral churches would do wonderful music. Your average parish church just did whatever they were able to do.
Now, moving over to art, when you took over the shrine, and I think you were responsible for having it turned into a basilica, right.
Now,
You changed significantly the artwork inside, didn't you? Or you
well,
turned it more to a Maronite type artwork?
well, see, the thing is, the actual church itself was never completed. It was the basic structure, but the artwork had never been commissioned uh, because, there's always a question of money,
Right,
finances. So I was fortunate that when I came, there was no mortgage on the church per se, the church building.
right,
So I was able to try to raise some money to uh, to get the church artwork commissioned, and I did use the concept of the Syriac art, what we call the Rabula style. And there's a company just outside of Pittsburgh called Newgill Studios. They've done some very nice work for Eastern churches as well as Latin Rite churches. And they were familiar with our art. And I said, look, we need to get artwork into the church. And they began with that. And so I've tried to get as much accomplished as possible so that it all blends in. It's all the same artist and the same style. Sometimes what happens in churches, things get put in piecemeal, and then it kind of doesn't always look good.
right,
In the old days, when you designed a church, you designed it from top to bottom.
right.
I mean, even the doorknobs and the hinges
Hmm.
were part of the design of the church,
Right.
which made them spectacular because everything just came together. It was, it's like a symphony. As long as you have everyone playing in concert, it's going to be wonderful.
Yeah.
And,
So you focused on, we'd always say, well, the smells and bells, right? But you saw it was important that both the art and the music needed to be right. I mean, you spent quite a bit putting a pipe organ in, a full choir. So you're bringing it all together. The mass, the art, the liturgy, the music as well.
I think it's the obligation of every church, every parish, whether it's large or small. Whatever you do should be done well. Uh, Obviously, there are limited financial resources, but that's no excuse for doing things poorly.
Right.
And we do here at the shrine what we can afford. And we've been fortunate that people have helped us in different ways. And we kind of take on one project at a time. I'm pleased with the music that we have, and I'm pleased with the artwork. And God bless our bishop. When I said to him, we need to make this shrine a basilica, he was very enthusiastic about it. And then Pope Francis was very open to that. So we're the only Maronite basilica outside of Lebanon. There are only two in the world: the original shrine of Our Lady of Lebanon in Lebanon, and North Jackson, Ohio. We are the only two, and I'd like to keep it that way.
Wow. Yeah, right, right. Now, with the time remaining, can you explain the difference in the structure? In other words, how the Maronites report up to the Pope in Rome and how that's different?
Well, it can get a little complicated, but to do it briefly,
Mm-hmm.
the Maronites, along with some of the other Eastern churches, are what they call patriarchal churches. We have a patriarch, and everyone is subject to the Holy Father. There's no question there. But if you are a patriarchal church, the synod of bishops of that particular church, amongst themselves, will elect a patriarch to be the head of the entire rite. Once the election takes place, then it is confirmed by the Holy Father. He can either accept it or he can reject it, depending upon circumstances, and usually he doesn't reject it. But so in a patriarchal church, especially the Maronites, the Maronite bishops elect the patriarch, and he is the head of all the Maronites throughout the world. However, his jurisdiction is somewhat limited because His direct jurisdiction is limited to Lebanon itself. Here in the West, his jurisdiction is liturgical more than anything, because we are a self-governing diocese, eparchy, and we are subject to Rome a little bit more than, say, the diocese in Lebanon. It gets a little legal and complicated, but the big thing is that the Maronite bishops elect their patriarch, and they elect who their bishops will be.
Okay.
Now, in some of the Byzantine churches that are not patriarchal churches, Rome has more of a say as to who their bishops will be.
Okay.
But essentially, in many respects, it is the same. The patriarchal churches have a little more autonomy than the non-patriarchal churches.
Okay. And I hope I can squeeze this in. If not, then we'd love to have you back again. But there's a big confusion among Roman Catholics as to the Byzantine and maybe even the Maronites, because of the proximity to the split with the Orthodox. Can you explain how that resulted? How, when the Orthodox left, maybe the Maronites and the Byzantine didn't also split?
Well, in all of the Eastern churches, there is always an Orthodox counterpart.
Okay.
Except with the Maronites. Maronites never split from Rome.
Okay.
And one person who was very adamant about making that point was Archbishop Fulton Sheen.
Oh, really?
He was very, very much telling people that the Maronites were never part of the schism. They never broke from Rome. But all of the other churches at one point or another broke, and many of them came back.
Oh, okay.
So that's why when you say Eastern Rite, you have to differentiate between Eastern Rite Catholic and Eastern Rite Orthodox.
Maybe that's the confusion.
Yeah. And the Maronites have no Orthodox. There's no such thing as an Orthodox Maronite.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. What I'd like to do, because, you've given several interviews on the radio, and you do an excellent job at explaining. I did want to start with this, but if in the future we could kind of pick your brain on other matters, we'd love to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and thanks so much, because I know you got a real busy schedule, especially going into Holy Week. So
it's only Lent.
Yeah.
It's only Lent.
Okay. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful day. Okay.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.